Dandelion is in a unique position as a company in that we do have full-time policy and regulatory affairs staff people. So it is my job to work on all of this stuff for Dandelion, and Dandelion as a member of NY-GEO is really just incredibly grateful for the NY-GEO association. It's having now done a lot of work in states where we don't have functioning industry associations. It's completely different to be trying to work on stuff as just a couple of companies versus a whole industry association like we have in NY-GEO. So the topic that I was going to just give everybody a little bit of an update on today. I think a lot of folks on this call are aware of the subject and have heard about it in the past. We've had discussions on these Friday calls in the past on this. And I just want to sort of give people an overview and make sure that we have a lot of time for questions on the subject. So the high level topic is around the idea of being able to have an owner of the ground source heat pump system who is not the owner of the building. So if you have a individual residence or a commercial building where for whatever reason, the building owner is either not in a position financially or for whatever other reason to be the first person owner of their system, that you could have a third party owner who could come in and own the ground loop and or the heat pump in the person's home. So this is done today extensively with rooftop solar. So about a third of all of the rooftop solar systems on individual homes in the United States today are not owned by the person who owns the home. They're owned by a third party ownership company. And that company generally owns systems on many, many different homes and has some sort of arrangement where the person who's living in the house, be it a renter or a homeowner, is paying monthly for the electricity coming from that solar system. And that can be a lease arrangement, it can be an energy as a service arrangement. The specific arrangements vary depending on which state you're in and what's allowed under the different state laws. But the basic setup is that it's a different owner who owns that rooftop solar in that case than the person who owns the home. And the same is true in the commercial sector for rooftop solar on large commercial buildings. About a third of those rooftop solar arrays that you see on large buildings are not owned by the building owner. They're owned by a third party owner. So what we're hoping to do for geothermal is the same thing. And when I say we, I mean industry at large, not just Dandelion. So Dandelion has worked in very close partnership with GeoExchange. I'm on the phone with Ryan Doherty very frequently, and we're working very closely together on trying to make sure that we can coordinate our efforts on this. And there are a number of other companies around the country that have been very active as well. Some of which are already in the midst of doing this, where they own geothermal systems, either individual systems in the yards of many different houses, or a larger geothermal system for a commercial building. And basically the reasons why you would want to do this have to do with, if it's an individual home, somebody might not be able to afford the financing or not want to take on the financing or not have the credit rating to qualify for financing for a first party ownership system. A household might not have the federal tax liability to take advantage of the income tax credit. So if you don't owe $5,000 or $10,000 or $15,000 in federal taxes every year, then your 30% investment tax credit from the feds doesn't help you pay for your system. They might be moving in the next 5 to 7 years and not plan on owning their home long enough to see that payback. And in fact, most Americans move every 5 to 7 years. So that's a very large percentage of homeowners. Or they might be renters and not own the home and not be able to control whether it gets a system. So in all of these instances, a third party ownership model can be helpful for the individuals who are living in the home to be able to get geothermal and take advantage of that. And as I said, it's about a third of all of residential rooftop systems are owned by a third-party owner, and we expect that we'd see a similar level in the geo industry. So that means that the geo industry installations would probably grow 50% faster with third-party ownership nationally than without. So we've been making this case to the federal government that we need to be able to have the sort of clear pathway for tax ownership purposes, that a third-party owner can claim the tax credit, generally in this case a commercial tax credit. So even if you're an individual homeowner, if it's a company that owns the ground loop in your yard, then they would be taking a commercial tax credit on that ground loop. And so you need to have the sort of pathway for that third-party ownership from a tax ownership perspective. And there's a bunch of details around sort of how the IRS has worked with other industries like rooftop solar around this, and it has to do with a sort of tax policy called limited use constraints. There's a lot of details on that. Bob Wyman, who I think is on this call, I thought I saw him, can definitely provide a lot of details about that for anyone who wants to get into the nitty-gritty. But at a high level, it has to do with the fact that it would be very difficult for the commercial owner of a ground loop on your property to come and take it back if you were to stop paying on it. And that means that for tax ownership purposes, the IRS could interpret that as being not really owned by that third party. If they can't come take it back, then does that third party really own it, or do you, as the property owner, implicitly own it? So we're trying to get clarity from the IRS on that. There's a bunch of details around the format for that guidance. Geo Exchange has paid one of the nation's top tax councils in Washington, D.C. To write up a proposed set of language that we've sent to Treasury and said, here, you can use this. And so that's called a revenue proceeding, and that was sent in January. There's been incredible amount of support from throughout the whole country from the geo industry. I think we had something like 80 different companies that signed on to a letter that went to the White House late last August, right after the Inflation Reduction Act passed, asking the White House to make sure that Treasury prioritized this guidance. There was also a letter from national environmental NGOs, and then a letter from the National Association of State Energy Offices. In other words, the NYSERDAs around the country have a national association, and their national association sent a letter to the Treasury Secretary last September. And then there was a letter from members of Congress that was led at the time by Representative Swazi, but also supported by Morell and Higgins from the New York delegation. And that was sent to the Treasury Department from those members of Congress last October. Unfortunately, the Treasury Department had a lot to do this year. They had so many specific pieces of guidance that they had to get out because they were under legislated guidelines that were in the Inflation Reduction Act. They had to issue guidance about EVs and domestic content and a bunch of other pieces of the Inflation Reduction Act that all had to come out on legislative timelines this year. And basically, we've been lost in the shuffle. We're still a niche industry. We've been unable to get the attention to get the Treasury Department to focus on it. So we're in another major push to get members of Congress to write to the Treasury Department again and again, encourage them to take this up as a priority. And we may be doing another industry letter. We may be doing another environmental community letter. But in the immediate, we are working on a congressional letter. It's being led by Representative Brian Higgins from the Buffalo area of New York. Bill Nowak on this call was instrumental in getting his staff and him excited enough about this to lead that letter, which is fantastic. And we'd love to get as many members of the New York delegation and any other states from anyone who's on this call who has a connection to another House member's office. We're working really hard right now to try to get people to sign on. So if you have any interest, please be in touch with me. I'll put my email in the chat. And Ryan Doherty and I will coordinate with you in terms of reaching out to your congressperson. So that's my spiel. I'm happy to answer questions. There's also other people on this call who can answer questions on this topic too. And thanks for the time to talk about it, JR.
Thank you, Heather. From a timekeeper standpoint, which is my basic job, because you and Jens are going to make it easy for me today, I'd like to let's go with about maybe 5 minutes of questions or comments, and then we'll get Jens on. And if we have time toward the end of the meeting, we'll open it back up for questions. So if we'll try, I guess, to do it without the hand raising, but if we need to, and there's so many people, we'll use the hand raising function. So right now, anyone, first person to ask, go ahead.
I'd like to say that there are a bunch of questions in the chat. Maybe we should go from that first.
Yeah, I'm looking at that. One of the
Okay.
ones that I'm seeing there is whether there would be an option for buying the system after a certain amount of time. And the answer to that, I know, is yes. There definitely are options for both extending the lease beyond an initial, say the lease is 20 years or 25 years. There would be options to extend again for another 5 years, or, you know, in 5-year chunks of time. And there's also the option for the building owner to buy the system at fair market value at the end of the
What
lease.
about a new buyer coming in, like someone's trying to sell their house? You know,
Yeah,
it's
so
harder to sell with the lease, but if the option was a new buyer could come in and add that, say, to their mortgage, that would be great, because, you know, it would make it a lot less expensive to purchase for them.
Yeah, I think that that's handled today in a number of different ways in the solar third-party ownership market. Sometimes it's required to be bought out with the house. Sometimes it's not, is my understanding. And then there are a bunch of different ways that that can be handled logistically. Bob may know more about that than I do in terms of the legal requirements, but I know from a practical commercial perspective that it sometimes goes to the new owner and sometimes doesn't.
Yeah, basically you'd have a lease on the property. So, and there would, and basically the new homeowner would become responsible for the payments. They could, in the process of making the sale, require that the buyout option be taken. They could, and then you could argue about whether or not it's going to be the seller or the buyer that makes the payment. But one would assume that the ground loop transfers with the property, and normally that would be the case. That's what happens with solar. Solar is a little bit different. They still do have liens. You should know, though, that the number of solar systems that don't transfer, you know, on sale is somewhere on the order of 1 to 3%. So it almost always happens because the new homeowner realizes that they've got a good deal and they want to keep it going.
Heather, do you want to take the questions from the chat just as you see them?
I guess I saw Anshul's question about Jamal Bowman. Definitely, that would be great if you can help us with that. I think the other question in here about fair market value and how it's calculated, Bob actually answered in the chat, which is like you get an accountant to give you a rate on, you know, what the depreciation of the system is every year. I don't see any others. I'm not sure if I missed any.
Okay, well, I think we'll have time at the end, and let's let Jens get in there. For those of you that don't know, Jens is our multi-talented president of New-York-GEO. He has a couple second lives, one in the medical industry, and he's also the I guess co-owner of Buffalo Geothermal and other things he'll have to tell you. Jens is going to talk today about boreholes and batteries. That's my summary. But I've been waiting to use this quote he made in some capacity, and this is the time. I love it. It's for a non-technical guy like me. His quote is, "Whatever you get from the borehole, you don't have to get from the grid." and so Jens, I guess with that, I'll turn it over to you. I can see your screen.
All righty. Can you hear and see me?
I can hear you.
Perfect. So let's go with the screen here for now, and we fix that later. So you might all recall and I'm just going to jump through some slides here back and forth, trying to shorten time. Rory Christian, the chair of the PSC, had asked us in a very inspirational speech at NY-GEO to figure out on how to fly to the moon. And he cited the Apollo program as a commitment by the US as a nation to fly to the moon without having figured out how to do this. And he draw the comparison that, this unprecedented challenge here on very quickly convert over to renewable energies. It has similar challenges. We haven't figured it all out yet, but we made a commitment, and we had to make a commitment to do all this and set policies in motion. So I want to run by you what we see as a pathway and why that is. And the point is that obviously we have to demonstrate that we can fly to the moon, and we have to make sure it's all well documented, because you don't want to set policies in motion which you don't know whether you can achieve that or reach that or not. So I usually love that slide. This is from the Energy Administration, and you can see here that for New York State, we have an unusual amount of heating load in a building in the northeastern US compared to the rest of the United States. And our cooling load is actually pretty small at percentage-wise. But keep in mind, that drives all the grid capacity. If 1% of the entire load can cause about 7 to 10 gigawatts of peak capacity in the grid, what do you think is 56% going to do when we convert that over to electricity? So that's kind of my attention getter to say, wow, how much is that? I showed the slide before. This is actually from NYSERDA. We have the total load is about 550 tera BTUs, which we're serving right now with fossil fuels, and about 10% of that is done by electric resistance heat right now. So how much is this? And you do the math and the calculations, and you take the full load hours for the whole United States, build an average, and you end up with about 120 gigawatts. That is without the hot water, and this is without pretty much without electric vehicle charging and without process heat. So this is an enormous amount, given that we only have about 38 gigawatts right now in generation capacity. And the summer peak ever, the highest ever, was close to 34 gigawatts. So we're not the only one ringing the alarm bell. It's actually the independent system operators here of New York State said, well, this is unprecedented. And we need to have an unprecedented amount of resources in order to have the generation which will be necessary to deliver sufficient energy for all that demand. So they project that we need about 120 up to 124 gigawatts of generating capacity. And specifically important is that they note a large portion of that is actually, it has to act like today's fossil fuel fire generation, which you turn on and off at demand. And there is nothing commercially available to provide dispatchable, non-emitting, and these are the two buzzwords, which they can turn on and turn off at the worst time. And it's got to be emission-free. And we just don't have that. It does not exist. So, we go forward, and we remember, Rory giving that speech at NY-GEO. And, you start to realize that we got to have a very different kind of technology available. So we're trying to run to the moon, and what we have available is almost not doing anything for us. And we completely underestimate what I call the giant elephant in the room. And we talk about batteries, and we talk about solar, and we want to save the planet, but if we don't look at the heating, all of that is dwarfed by it. So for example, the heating outlook is about 120 gigawatts. The peak impact of all the battery charging for electric vehicles in New York currently is 6 gigawatts. It's 5% of what the heating does. And you all know my favorite slide here, where, you know, a heating plant here is actually making hot water. And in the same moment, the air tower, the cooling tower, is rejecting heat into the atmosphere. So why do we reject it into the atmosphere when we can use it and redirect that heat into the tanks? And actually, my point was always that if you look at the loop field itself, we're taking heat instead of rejecting it into the atmosphere. This is going back from December 31st, 12 months. And you can see the loop field started around 30 degrees. And this ended up to be around 90 with some peaks there. So we're heating up the ground and then we retrieve it again for the heating season in a very elegant fashion. So having said all this, we had actually a wonderful case study building here. This is Zero Place in New Paltz in the Hudson Valley, pretty harsh climate. And, you know, this is the average new build. And we were trying to push this to say, let's see what we can do in terms of energy upgrades. We have a solar system on the roof. And you can see here, even the awnings for the residents on the southern side are all solar panels. And kind of maximize what we can get out of this and how efficient we can make the building. Nothing else was intended. And boy, we were surprised when we saw the first data coming up here. So this building is unique. First of all, it got the first award, the first Building of Excellence award as a winner from New York State. And so they supported this, but also that NY-GEO took up the helm here and actually started to monitor this building, because it was obviously very important to confirm how geothermal works, but also to provide granular data to understand what we need for grid planning and how much capacity do we need in the grid. So this is a GEO system which does 100% hot water, which does 100% heating, and which does 100% cooling. There is no other way. There's no gas line into this building. And the only gas line is going into the emergency generator outside. So the idea was to push this entire thing. And the point is, you know, we have about 15 wells in here, and then they make up about 15%, maybe 20% of the entire footprint of the building. So we have a lot of space underneath in order to even do a much higher building there. So we tried to achieve net zero, and we almost did that. So the building was producing, actually, in terms of grid draw, 96.5% of the entire energy throughout the year came actually from the solar system. And it covered, I mean, we essentially reached almost net zero in a multifamily this size, which is pretty amazing, obviously. Now, I want to show you through some couple of numbers here. And these are independent numbers from Pasquale Strocchia. He is an energy rater in New Paltz, and he's monitoring this building and the electricity use. And also from Hugh Henderson, who's doing the monitoring for NY-GEO independently. A couple of things. If you look at the average energy use per apartment, this was about between 300 and 430 kilowatt hours, roughly, on average. To put it in perspective, an average apartment right now in New York State uses about 600 kilowatt hours per month. That is without any heating and without any hot water. In other words, this building was performing about half of the energy draw, including heating, including hot water, including everything, than an average building today is in there without the thermal load, without heating and hot water. So that was the first amazing finding. Couple other things blew us away. So you're looking at the peak summer day. you see here, this is the peak moment in summer. And the entire building was drawing 71 kW. This is after the solar system lost everything in terms of contributing capacity. This is all on the grid. And this was the highest draw ever. That was on the hottest day of the year, and it was around 8 p.m. Now, what do you think is going to happen to the winter load? And that was the shocker. So the summer load, by the way, an average building right now, we had just this the one which was there here in Buffalo. The load request to the utilities, same size building, was 1,000 kW. So here, the peak in the summer for the entire building with all the accessories, appliances, elevators, everything was 71 kW. Now comes the winter, and you would expect that to be much, much higher, right? Absolutely wrong. The winter peak was occurring in the evening of the peak day, but it was occurring at 17 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was only 65 kW. The actual heating peak or HVAC peak was about 50 kW, and that was occurring in the same morning, in the same day, but in the morning at -6 degrees outside. So the GeoShift system has shifted the peak into the early evening hours, and it was not the heating which was driving it anymore. It was actually people coming home and using their appliances. So suddenly it kind of made us wake up and saying, wow, where is this all coming from? And what is the trick here? So I want to jump to the next guy here. This is Hugh Henderson. He is he's an engineer, and he does confirm and monitor this building for NY-GEO. And he pretty much confirms all the same things. I'm gonna summarize part of what he's doing right there. So a few observations. What I was just emphasizing on. This is the outdoor temperature on the peak day. And the peak for the HVAC, for all the heat pumps, occurred again at 7:30 in the morning. However, the peak of the building was occurring at around 5 p.m., 5:30 p.m., where it was much warmer, and it was not the heating system driving this anymore. The point is that we have already our peak in the system at that time, and that peak is much higher. In other words, you have built a building like this, we don't have to upgrade the grid anymore. The grid is already correctly sized for that. Now, let's march on because we want to get a little bit more granular here. And actually, this is, here's the solar. So let's move on. And we were just then wondering, where's this energy coming from and why does it all behave like this, which was very surprising. I just want to show you that, for example, this is an electric battery, and this is the largest electric battery in Southern Australia, at least a few years ago was the largest, the big Tesla battery. And you can see here where, it takes energy out and it puts energy in. And then this is what this graph is all about over a day period on a day as an example here. So it stabilizes the grid, but it also releases a large amount of capacity when needed, and then puts actually back this capacity by using or recharging the battery in the off-peak time. Now, I make the argument, you look at the loop field here, and this is a loop field temperature on an average day in the spring. You can see on how if the blue line is the supply temperature into the loop field, and the red line is the entering water temperature from the loop field. And you can see the building fluctuates, depends on what time of the day it is, whether it takes energy out of the loop field or puts energy into the loop field. How is that different to a large scale battery on the electric side? I guess my point is that the loop field behaves exactly like a battery It just is thermal energy stored and not electricity being stored in the battery. And now you take it on and saying, okay, well, this is exactly how it reacts directly to input and output. So nothing is getting, there's no other way to discharge the thermal energy than putting it into the loop field. And actually, then you get it out. There's no other source for it, except obviously the operating draw for the compressors in terms of electricity. So essentially, you look at the summertime. This is now in June, July. The loop field gets permanently heated up, as we all know. And in the wintertime, it all draws energy from it, but it fluctuates, and every single BTU or kW is either taken out or interacted with this battery. So it acts exactly like a large-scale grid battery. Now, make no mistake, you have the most efficient building we could come up with. And on the peak day, 90% of that entire load the building is using is for heating and domestic hot water. The thermal load still is enormous. Only 10% of that were actually the other appliances or other electric load of the building. And so this is essentially what we're saying. You know, you need a huge amount of capacity, and that's pretty much what NY-GEO is saying too now. You know, we need an enormous amount of capacity just for that one single hour. Now, let's be a little bit more granular and look at the data and understand where that extra energy is coming from. So the orange graph here is actually the loop field and the contribution or the energy release from the loop field into the heating system. And the small gray area here is all the other rest of the appliances in the building or consumers in the building. And it shows you on the peak hour, on the peak day, it really is over 90% of the total energy use of the building. And the trick then is to say, okay, how do we satisfy all this? And there's another interesting implication here. Look on how the loop field is reacting during the day to an increased energy demand of the building. It essentially lowering it during the day, but on the peak time, it is actually increasing its capacity or its contribution. So while it's not dispatchable, it actually acts like a dispatchable. At the highest energy use, it releases the most amount of energy. And actually, this is looking at this more granular. This is only looking at the heating at the electric demand for the system, and this is coming from the ground battery. This is the contribution to the heating demand here. This is now the 120 gigawatts, the heating demand for this building is. However, 84 kilowatts are coming from the loop field. So while it's not dispatchable, it actually contributes to the energy usage of that building when you need it most. And it follows the energy consumption automatically. It's pretty ingenious, I would call, because but it's not dispatchable. It acts like a dispatchable battery. And when the energy use of the building goes down because there's a lesser thermal use in the afternoon with solar gains, etc., the contribution from the battery goes down only to bring it up again. So the point is that if you now look at the total energy use of the building after what the battery contributes to you, then you see the following. This is the non-geothermal demand on the grid. And this is actually now the kWs the geosystem was using. So this big monster, which was up here, gets significantly reduced. And this is another way to look at this. So here's where we before in terms of what is the energy demand. However, the contribution of the geothermal loop field has reduced that demand dramatically. And now you have an almost flat curve. So if you are a grid planner, if you look at, if somebody's on the call for you from the utility, you might appreciate that on how much how much the curve is flattened. The little ups and downs is actually when hot water is generated or not. You put 100 buildings like this together, this line is almost flat, almost a flat load curve. That's a dream for a utility. And that's actually even on the peak day. So we need a permanent amount of energy to have those buildings and to power those buildings. Now I run people again through how much is this worth. You know, the loop field here was actually using or essentially delivered about 1.7 megawatts on the peak heating day. And if you look at the heating capacity when needed, and you're looking at currently the state is paying $567 per kilowatt hour in terms of grid capacity storage. Well, that means we avoided almost $1 million of grid capacity storage on the peak day, because that's otherwise we would have to create in the grid. You know, that's quite an impressive number. To put it in perspective, this entire GEO system only cost about $900,000. So it essentially, you could make the argument it paid for itself in a day in terms of what it saved on the grid, in terms of capital costs there. The other number, for example, what this was saving or looking at what we're looking at, you know, New York State is currently paying about $6 billion for a 1.2 gigawatt transmission line to Quebec in the summertime. That's about $5,000 per kW of capacity just for the transmission line. We're not talking about the actual power delivery or how much the power is. That is just for the wire. And this is only a contract for the summer, since Quebec needs it for the winter heating themselves. They have the same problem we do, but they have an excess energy in the summertime. So we're paying a huge amount for this kind of tapping into a storage or tapping into energy to be delivered during the peak time, which is renewable and which is dispatchable. Now, if you look at the generators currently, wind runs about $1,200 per kW. In terms of capacity, but that's intermittent. A lot of time the wind doesn't necessarily blow when we need it most. So, you know, the argument is that GEO is certainly a bargain. That kind of thermal energy storage, and I'm making the point that every building out there is actually using, is actually making all the energy it needs. All we have to do is being able to store it. And we always knew it, but this time we're actually having this measured in a granular way. And it is very, very important to understand that if we're building buildings that way, the measured peak is less than in the summertime. And even the summertime peak is reduced by about half because of the efficiency of the GEO system. So that makes sure we can essentially take this entire elephant out of the room, because if we're building buildings that way, the elephant is gone. We have a lesser stress on the grid than we have with normal systems today served by gas. So we didn't really intend to do that. We wanted to see if we can get a rocket into orbit. We didn't want to fly to the moon. But then we kind of looked outside and said, well, isn't that the moon down there? And, you know, we had NY-SERDA along for this ride and Hugh Henderson, and he said, yep, that's the moon. We made it there. And boy, this is not the way, but it's one of the ways we can get there. That's kind of the take home message here. Let me stop.
Jens, excuse me a second. Yeah. I'm watching the clock, so don't get mad at me. I'm thinking this might be a good time for questions. And
sure.
I know that Bob and Will Lang and Alan Scholl had some comments in the chat. If they want to elaborate or ask now, go ahead.
I wanna, if I could take 2 more minutes,
sure.
JR, please.
Sure.
Because I was asked very rightfully so by by some of the DPS staff about having conventional systems essentially. And I just want to show you, they said, well, this is great for a building like this, but what about, you know, the average building in New York State, like affordable housing? Just want to show you something here. So this is pretty much a study from the New York City Department of Housing and Development, where they looked at normal housing stock before 2003, post 2003, and these are all the passive house buildings. So these are gas heated, these are electrical heated they have, and they actually measured all this. And this is the target for passive houses, which is 30 BTUs per square foot per year. None of them, when measured, actually achieves all that. And you can see that the electric buildings are much better than the gas heated buildings because there's a higher efficiency. They're automatically 100% efficient. So now they ask me, what about an average Joe retrofit, like a 70s housing authority here, which, you know, has some mild upgrades, you know, a couple of double pane windows 20 years ago and a little blown in insulation. How do we do with them? I mean, we get it with the super efficient buildings. Well, we have that data actually. And if you now look at it, this was zero place. This is unusual. This is 17 feet per square, 17 BTUs per square foot. That was Lockport housing. You take an average 1970 building, which has very moderate insulation upgrades, like a little bit of blown in cellulose 20 years ago. And you pop in a GEO system and it immediately is better than today's passive house standard, which others don't achieve. And that was knocking me out. The second example was a new build here in Buffalo, New York. New York State Energy Code plus a geothermal building, nothing more. It immediately is performing about 30% better than passive house standard, which others don't achieve, due to the efficiency and the contribution of the thermal battery. I stop there. I hope we can generate enough discussion here. So shoot at me.
If we can't get discussion on these two topics, Jens, we can't get discussion on anything. So
Yeah, then our life is boring.
thank you very much, and thanks to NYSERDA for allowing us to get that you know, certificate of
Legitimacy.
significance, I guess.
No, we just want to make sure. I got to thank them for taking this up and taking this bull by the horn, because it allows us to, I mean, it takes away the perception of bias for us, because we're all passionate about it, but we want to make sure that this is data which is legit and which can then, where we can teach others about what actually the geosystems bring to the table. All righty. Any questions?
Questions for Jens or Heather?
Yeah, I've got Bob here. Yeah, I've got a question. Hey, Jens, when you're looking at the NY-GEO numbers on how much additional capacity we need, I'm curious. I know we're always talking about sort of oil and gas, or I guess these days mostly gas, in terms of the buildings we're replacing. But the reality is we got a lot of buildings that are heated with electric resistance, and you can heat 3 or 4 buildings using heat pumps with the same amount of electricity that you would have used to heat one building with electric resistance. Are you aware, did NY-GEO, when it's figuring out how much additional we need, were they at all considering that we may be retrofitting not just oil and gas buildings and thus increasing the electrical demand, but also potentially trying to retrofit electric resistance buildings and thus getting a whole lot of buildings essentially for free?
Yeah, I mean, the modeling is done with air source heat pumps and electric resistance hot water heating.
No, but
Replacing
gas or replacing electric resistance?
You're replacing both. You're replacing a huge amount of gas, and you're replacing about 10% of the building with electric. I mean, who have currently electric resistance heat.
So only 10% of the buildings now with electric resistance, huh? Okay.
Correct.
Seems to me that it makes sense for the industry to push for more than replacing 10%, because the remaining 90% of buildings that are using electric resistance
No,
for
no.
space
Let me
heating are
be clear.
phenomenally inefficient.
Yeah, currently 10% of the buildings are using electric resistance heat. 90% are fossil fuels.
Oh, okay. Well, if 10% are now using electric resistance, the amount of electricity now used for those 10% would be enough to cover 40% of the buildings then, right?
Well, that is assuming, keep in mind, it is not, because how efficient is an air source heat pump without the contribution of this thermal battery on the peak day?
So
That, I mean, you know,
my
following,
apologies. I was assuming ground source heat pumps. If it was air source, then it'd only be like, yeah,
it's
1
about,
point.
it's about, I mean, at -6 degrees, I have yet to see an air source heat pump run more efficient than a COP of 1.2. And that's pretty much also confirmed by Hugh Henderson, who did all that performance studies for NY-GEO.
Okay.
So, but the difference was that even on the peak day, this system here didn't know how cold it is outside. It was operating at a COP of 3.6. And that's the huge difference. That's the contribution of the ground battery, which air source doesn't have by definition. And the other argument, you know, so in other words, it's really not what matters so much on how much what is the average annual performance, because we have to design the grid and build out the grid to deliver this energy, and we might build in that capacity in there, which we only need for a few hours a year. How efficient is that? The rest of the time, all that infrastructure is sitting at idle and costing an enormous cost to the ratepayer. So I showed you the load curves, how much balanced they are. So it's not really a problem to build out a grid if the grid is used on a constant basis. The load factor is 80 or 90%. Because you have that additional energy, and I've shown you the load curve coming from the loop fill from that thermal battery. If you now have that energy acting almost as a dispatchable battery, where it automatically draws more or less, that's really the key factor here. And that's the value. Forget about the overall energy usage. So I think we're having the wrong matrix, is what I'm saying. We're focusing on the overall energy used for the year. What is really the key is how much do we need on the peak day or the peak hour or the peak minute? Because that drives utility costs. We cannot afford to be without power, and we have to build up all this electricity generation and, you know, transmission. What choice do we have? Otherwise, if we're doing blackouts on the coldest day of the year, I think we're doomed. So, but then on the other side, you're investing hundreds of millions of dollars, or for example, in this peak transmission line to go to Quebec for $1.2 billion, and it's replacing essentially a 1.2 gigawatt peak power plant. That's really what's going on. And the rest of the time, we tap more into it, but it's essentially setting it idle. But it has to be paid for, depreciated, maintained for, being an enormous cost to the ratepayer.
Jens, could I ask another question?
Any?
From the graphs you're showing about when the energy is demanded and when it's provided, would you say that this building is self-regulating?
Yeah, that's the whole point. At least the geosystem is. And the geosystem automatically increases its contribution. I mean, the loop field is automatically contributing more energy when you need it more. That's the trick. I mean, we admit it's not dispatchable, but boy, if it reacts exactly the same way as somebody in a control room would dispatch the energy, what's the difference?
So within itself, it's dispatchable.
Correct. That's the trick. It automatically, yes.
Is that because the return water is colder? Like, why is it pulling more heat from the loop field?
Yeah, the return water, actually the water capacity is the same, but you're putting, essentially what it does, it increases its delta T, correct?
Yeah, okay.
So
John
now
Paul-
suddenly, instead of 4-degree delta T at the same amount of water flow, now the delta T goes up to 8 degrees, which doubles the capacity, doubles the energy coming from the loop field. So it automatically regulates the amount of delta T. It also automatically reacts to the flow. So more heat pumps are on, it increases the flow. But the graph you saw is pretty much just measuring the delta T, and you see how that goes up and down. Depends on how much energy it needs to provide.
Yeah,
That's the ingenious part. It automatically reacts to input and output that way.
John
So
Paul
we have-
has his hand up very politely, whereas I just jumped in, so I just want to.
Yeah, no, this is important to understand. It automatically reacts to input and output. And we never had any kind of energy source doing that. It's just fascinating how this works. We always knew it in a certain way. We had a gut feeling, but now we're actually quantitating it and showing that on graphs. And that's really the key aspect here. So if you're looking, I can only emphasize this on the graph here. So you see that here, this is measuring the amount of kilowatts displayed or delivered. And this is the amount of total energy use of the building. And this is only the thermal load. You can see that this is coming from the grid, about 35 kW on the peak time, but 84 kW is coming from the ground battery. And so the total use of, so up here, this is the total energy use in terms of the thermal use of the building, which at the peak time is 90% of the total energy use. And if that is reduced during the day, because now we suddenly have the sun come up, the battery contribution has been reduced automatically. So it follows the total use of the energy. So the total heating and hot water usage automatically. And that's fascinating. This is not the delta T. This is actually directly kWs. If you're looking at the delta T, this is what you see in the wintertime. And it goes up and down, but it pretty much depends on how many heat pumps are turning on and turning off in that moment. And it follows pretty much so here we have a day where, even in the wintertime, we use a little bit of, some heat pumps are running in air conditioning when they have a full blast of solar gain on one apartment. But that changes and goes up and down. So this is a constant giving and taking, going in and out of the loop. And then during the night here, or this is then a colder day, this was over here a warmer day, and this is going 48 hours back. So this is a period of 48 hours. Suddenly the temperatures get colder and it's 100% in heating mode. But it fluctuates significantly. And this is measuring delta T by itself. So it's nice to see that. And that's the important part. It automatically is reacting to an increased request for thermal energy.
Jens, I'm going to jump in if you don't mind and let John Paul get his question in. Sorry about
Absolutely.
that.
So, Jens, you said that if all buildings were built like Zero Place, that no upgrades would be needed. The Brattle Group study on, what was it, Rhode Island or whatever, said something similar, that if, everything was done with GEO, no grid upgrades would be needed. Great, we know that. How do we get there? Like, how do we get utilities? How do we get enough people to realize that this needs to be a much larger part of the answer instead of everybody just looking to air source?
Correct. And I think that's, in one way, I hope that everybody, including a policymaker and whether it's the Public Service Commission, the DPS, NY-GEO, the Assembly, the Senate, all see the same thing we're seeing. And we'll publish those reports here. And they speak for themselves. Of course, now they say, okay, you flew to the moon. You figured out one way to fly to the moon. And then you say, can you do it again? I said, well, if we can do this once, and I've showed you other buildings who operate in the same way. Now, suddenly, now that we knew what to look for in terms of performance matrices. So this is definitely gonna change. And I would argue that air source, again, I'm biased, I admit that, but the data suggests that air source will be part of the problem.
Yeah.
And not the solution.
Defrost and going into, electric resistance heat, it's going to do the same thing.
And it's the same. I mean, we came out of being in Buffalo, New York. We came out of this terrible blizzard at Christmas last year, and we learned one thing: they don't do well under 6 foot of snow. And here, none of our systems even went down or had a hiccup. They just don't know how cold it is outside or how much snow is outside. None of those are issues. So you have the resilience, you have the performance, and you have essentially a performance of a whole building. Like I said, all you need to do, you take a 70s building, multifamily affordable housing, you pop in a GEO system, bang, you're at passive house standard. It's that simple. So what I would ask for is to say, we should at least have a policy where, every system which is feasible should be geothermal. I understand the challenges in dense urban environments. I would argue we're even making significant progress there. We're squeezing, we need much lesser footprint. We now drill underneath the building. We drill out of an angle from the sidewalks. We figure this out pretty quickly since we understand what the need is. But you got to also send market signals. And I'm sitting also there and saying, we're putting a huge amount of money on air source heat pumps, and we're creating a problem with that. And sometimes I see a developer sitting there and saying, geothermal for a $30 million building was $10,000 too much. So we went with electric resistance heat. And I'm sitting there saying, what a chaos you do in the next in 5 years from now or 10 years
but we're compounding the issue by doing all of that, and like what we need to do is get more people to realize that the problem is going to be worse. And the gas people realize that, and they're using that as a weapon against electrification.
Correct. But I mean, one of the things we do is we show people, here's a pathway forward.
We need to show more people.
And I mean, for me, I don't understand why you have a new build building and you are actually putting an air source heat pump in there. I don't get it. I get it in retrofits. We have to show them that we can do this. I think we already have working examples of that, how we do that in dense urban environments. Those systems are going in right now. But in new build, it's not conceivable to me what we're doing to us and to the grid down the road.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, and I think down the road, I don't know what we're going to have. Are we going to have demand-based rates where those people or people are paying a huge premium on this? Are those, are the developers or the owners now getting not as much rent because people have huge utility bills? I don't know. I mean, this is a first of its kind, the first time where we have that kind of granular data and show them a solution forward. And if we implement it, and this was not hard to do. I mean, the total cost of this was about 10% higher than a conventional building, but we don't even have to go that crazy. If we're just taking a regular system today, a house in terms of energy code, New York State, and I've shown that to you. That's already, you pop in a GEO system, you're immediately better than any passive house system out there.
So you said it was 10% more than a conventional system. Is that before or after?
10% of a building cost was, I mean, the building cost was about 10% higher.
And that's after claimed incentives?
That was actually before clean heat incentives. So at that time, this was
lower than a conventional building.
This was actually a building which still went under the NY-GEO program in 2017. And that building was actually great because it was, I mean, and we got $108,000 under that program for that building. Thank you, NY-GEO again. So this was great. But this is, I mean, the best thing was that they invested into an independent monitoring and verification. That I think is the best investment NY-GEO has done here. because it gives us the granular data to make those arguments, and it makes us all legit. And it's the
And
first step.
excuse
I
me,
mean,
I
it's
wanna-
really the first step here.
Yeah.
for everybody.
I want to watch the time and let everybody get their weekend started, but Scott Smith's got his hand up, and I'd like to hear what his comments
Hi,
are.
Scott.
Hey, Jens. Yeah, I mean, well, so we're already 5 minutes over. I don't have to take too much time to say this now, but I mean, I think I agree with part of what you and John are saying, Jens, that we need to do a better job of getting the word out on how much of a benefit geothermal can be to the grid, and how much more sort of reasonable, or how much more feasible it's going to be to electrify everything if most of the systems are geothermal. But I think we've been so I agree we need to do that for sure. There are a bunch of people, myself included, that already get that, and we're out talking to people. And one of the things that I'm, struggling with as I talk to people is, there are even some people. So I met with this developer in the Albany area who's building a new building, and they 6 or 12 months ago thought that all of the buildings they were going to build moving forward were going to have ground source heat pump systems. That was they made a decision. We understand they're the best. We get it. They found a way that during that time frame, maybe it's a little longer than that, 12 to 18 months. They found a way under that time frame to make their development performance work. But they can't now. And they met with us and said, we can't get quotes for a loop field that are reasonable enough for us to be able to make the pro formas work for our development pro formas work, right? And so, even for those that get it, we need capacity to deliver the systems at a reasonable cost. And so I just want to make that point that, yes, absolutely, we need to do a better job. Everybody needs to understand that, of what the future is going to hold if we don't have geothermal systems in most of our buildings. And sort of a chicken and egg thing, but on the flip side, we also need to, all of us work together to make sure that there's capacity to deliver even what's being demanded now, right? So it's a terrible situation to have a developer say, I thought I was going to do geothermal and all my buildings moving forward. Now I don't think I can do them anymore. I have to do air source heat pumps because I can't get drillers to give me a reasonable quote on the loop field, right?
Yeah, Scott, to answer that question or that comment or respond to that comment from you, I think it's a very valid one, but it's a problem which is more or less self-made on the administrative side, because what you're saying is the developer rather puts 3 times the peak demand on the grid because he's not paying for that. It's actually the utilities are paying for that, e.g. the ratepayer. And so it's the wrong structure there, because those costs are socialized. You make a load letter and you say, and I told you that here, you request 1,000 kW for a similar building. And who's paying for that? He gets it for free. He doesn't care anymore. So in other words, there needs to be a mechanism by saying, wait a minute, this is not free. It's socialized. We're all paying for it. And it's not the fault of the GEO system. I gave you the numbers here. The GEO system pays for itself in 1 day. The system of this one here was under $1 million. The complete costs. It's underneath the building, and it saved 1.7 megawatts for the peak day. How much is that worth in grid capacity? So just because we're shifting the costs to somebody else, e.g. the ratepayer, you follow me? That's really the problem. Well, we're suddenly creating a value proposition here, which
I follow you. I mean, I think, Jens, there's also, I don't think I feel like you're maybe not hearing my point. I follow you, and I agree with you. I think even this developer is sort of sophisticated enough to kind of see that dynamic. And maybe I overplayed the cost part of it. It's not just the cost. It's actually, can they get somebody to do it or not, right? And they have a bunch of people that typically have worked with in the past, drillers that worked with in the past, and they're saying they can't get, in some cases the cost is too high, but in other cases it's just they can't do it for 6 months. And they can't wait that long.
Well,
Building.
I live in that world right now, and I'm responding to every inquiry, and we're planning those buildings, and I must say now the Inflation Reduction Act significantly helps in this. Quite honestly, every analysis I've ever done with a developer, we came to a very quick, the inflation reduction incentives here, specifically for affordable housing, etc., makes this the cheapest option by far. So the cost is not the issue anymore.
Perception of cost.
In terms of that, and the capacity, I have no problems responding to demand and actually delivering. I'm doing that right now. So have him call me, be happy to talk to him. That maybe is an excuse, but I don't see that in the marketplace right now. We
Okay.
serve all our customers and all our inquiries.
Okay, folks.
I absolutely appreciate your comments.
Yeah, Scott, yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because you're not the only one that asked that question. And it's good that we have a good response for it. Folks, it's about 4:12 or something. I'm gonna thank Jens and Heather. Remind people that if you can help Heather out with her issues and have contacts with congressional people, please get in contact with somebody from NY-GEO. We're recording this, so it will be available to folks if you want to refer back to either one of those presentations. And we will see you in 2 weeks. Thank you very much.
JR, one final thought. What
Gotta
we're
be
dealing
quick.
with is not the cost, it's the perception. Geothermal has a perceptual problem, not a real one. And that's what we
Okay.
got to deal with.
Let's
Well,
talk about that next meeting.
Very good.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you. Thanks all for coming. Bye-bye.
Thank you.